Chish khati iki ya an katan. Shukwa aya just ach shik o has yu katangitin yu akwatan. Yohan ko akwashyata kakaya kakitu adek akakwanikiya. At achtashi yedlaki just the katati yejani qisakhan qatisha antin. At achtashi Dehuch aya chidzi yagi chitlay tleshkatuash kuhayukatangi kahakosti hasakawa achashu shehihi. To awe you do a sock yet atka. Tlektehin teat tlain kudzati. Sha ka nach away jiyausatan. Just the cut we ask Kwani, Sha yadach awas etl. Jatay nach as schwudzenech. Konek he uwe ik. Khatia achchike. Khatia achchike. We are dia nach awe chakuta as Kwani aye wutian. Hasu konek he uwe ik. Isau tua ach. Isau tua ach. Ye awa hastu yu katangi. Tletzin we kle nach as. Jit awe has awati. Hastu tletzini tin. Yis as Kwani awe aushiyech. Ye awa ha ye chini ya yedat ya atkatu tsugachtu leyech ya hashagun has to hitki tsugachtu leyech gulchish yitu shatik tzi atwe adat yu agachtu la at ya yagi gulchish. I want to acknowledge my family and my ancestry as we get started. I am the proud husband of my wife here on the right, who empowers and enables me to go and talk to people and to raise children in a bilingual household. The Tlingit language went about 60 years without having a single new birth speaker, and we have 3 birth speakers right here. So from the time they're little, and I want to acknowledge some friends of mine. One who was raising her child in Spanish, she was from Uruguay, and another who was raising her child in French. She was from Great Britain, but her mother was French. And I would watch them. I was like, "You only speak that to your kids?" And so before we had our first child, we said, "Well, let's try it." And if this is something you engage in, because sometimes we have multilingual households. Maybe someone's Hawaiian and they fall in love with someone who's Tongan, and they can't decide which language, so they default to English. But I encourage you to find another way. But to have a bilingual home, there's a lot you got to figure out. Our language is highly endangered, so we'd go to the elders and say, "How do you say wipe your butt?" And how do you say, that stinks, and don't eat that. There's a whole bunch of stuff that you don't really say well, I don't know what kind of classrooms you got, but you don't usually say them in the classroom, right? I am Tlingit, I'll show you our people's territory. I'm also Haida, I'm Yupik, I'm Sami. We were in Sapmi when we took this photo, and so I just want to honor our ancestors, and especially those who suffered to bring us to where we are with what we have. I also want to give a lot of acknowledgement to the people of Hawaii, especially at Kahakaula o Ke'ilikilani, where I achieved a PhD in Hawaiian and Indigenous language and culture revitalization. It was a wonderful group. It all started, I went to a conference, kind of like this one. There was a dinner, I went in, and I saw some people at a table. I said, "Can I come sit with you?" And it happened to be the founders of the Aha Punana Leo language movement. And one of their advisors, Dorothy Lazur, who was Mohawk. And I just had a wonderful, wonderful time with them. And they led me to believe that we could do a lot when it comes to our language. This is our territory. We're pretty big. Some colonizer came and drew a border over our lands. So we are Canadian on one side, and we belong to, we live in the United States on the other side. But we are an international language program. We really try to overcome the separation that the border creates. But if someone gets a DUI, if someone has some sort of difficulty with any of their birth certificate or anything, they might not be able to go to some of our communities. So we've been working a lot on reconnection, and the language has been our focus. We are also related to Dene languages. We put the na in na Dene. So we are ancestrally connected to this region, so it's always fun to come home. Because whenever I come to this area, it's like, oh, nice. It's been about 30,000 years. It's so nice to be here. We have several dialects in our language. There's 2 of them that are pretty strong, one of them that we're holding on to, and one of them that is gone now. But we learn a lot from studying. It's probably the original Tlingit language. We have 5 master-level birth speakers, so we know, I've been counting them. That's been part of my work, is trying to keep track of them, to figure out what we need to do. We do a lot of language documentation. We have, even though we have maybe 10 people in the whole world who can really speak this language, we have hundreds who are learning, and we're continually trying to push ourselves in terms of balancing keeping people in the language and teaching them about the structure of the language, and also letting them have a sense of ownership of the language, and then holding on to the things that we don't want to shift too far. And then trying to figure out how to translate things like skibbity toilet or whatever they're saying these days. It's taught in about half of our communities. We have about 19 Tlingit communities. About half of them have Tlingit taught in the schools or in the communities. We have 1 language nest. We had 2, but 1 shut down. So we have 1 that's been running since about 2018. And we have several programs that, when I look at this is how I sort of envision program development. Since I say, get to the middle. So on the outside is your cultural immersion program, where language is your medium of communication, but you teach your language, and then you can move towards language immersion. And for me, language immersion means you don't speak the language, let's create an environment so you can learn the language. And then you get into dual language, which means we'll spend a portion of our day using our indigenous language as the medium of education and communication, and then we'll use another portion of our day to speak English. Those who do dual language programs, there's usually 2 numbers. The first number is, I think, your indigenous language and the percentage of time you spend in it, and the second number is the colonizer language, English, and how much time you spend in that. So if you're a 50-50 school, half your day is in your indigenous language. So that gives you, I think, some reasonable targets. So you could say, well, we'll start as a 10-90. So if we're in school for 8 hours a day, we'll spend half an hour, or whatever the math is, in our language, and then we'll switch over to English. But that means you're not just sort of like putting up pictures and speaking English and teaching the language, but you're teaching history in the language, you're teaching math, you're teaching science. And so this pushes you to the middle, which is language medium. Language medium means we have 1 primary language within our entire school, and that's our indigenous language. So that's our target. We are trying to figure out how to move there. And one of the things that we do, I work at the University of Alaska Southeast on Akwan Ani, in Tlingit Ani. Also, some people call it Juneau, Alaska, I guess. And so we are developing a Master of Arts in Teaching Indigenous Languages, and when graduates go through that program, they will be fully licensed, certified teachers who are on par with any teacher in the state of Alaska in a public school system. So I guess our general operating philosophy is communication is always more important than perfection. We are not in the perfection business at all. My job is to get people talking and to try and avoid correcting them on the spot, but just to allow them to talk. And so if someone speaks to me, one of the things I try not to do is, what are you trying to say? Or say it back to them correctly, or launch into a lesson on how to use these particles differently. My goal is to figure out what they're saying and to respond to them in the language. And to just say, I hear you, just like that story of the trees. I hear you. I have something to say as well. And then that love conquers all. And so it's really self-love, group love, and really trying to come back to this place and move away from lateral violence, move away from some of the ugliness that we sort of see in some of our communities. I'll just speak for ourselves. The boarding school era was horrendous, and it has these echoes. And in these echoes, you have harm, and you have harmfulness, and you have a lot of looking the other way or not talking openly about some of these things. And so that's the difficult part of what I'd like to talk about today. But I would say I love how the last presentation ended. When you build your language center, build a healing center right next door. So like really think about behavioral health, think about a spa, think about all these different things to keep yourself centered and to keep yourself well. Because I think trying to overcome genocide and colonization is a monumental task that absolutely can be done. But I believe it takes intention, and it also takes honest conversations, continual self-analysis, and complete and utter belief in yourself that you can take these gifts that were given to us and protect them for the future. So we do a lot of breathing exercises when we teach Tlingit, because we have people who are scared. They're so nervous about getting it wrong or ruining the language or failing. And so there's so much. When you go from, there's about 25,000 Tlingit people in the world, and if 10 of them can speak, and of those 10, most of them are over 80, like that's a terrifying situation. So we try and think of a lot of things that we can do with our students. So we went to our speakers and we said, how do you say like breathe in? And it's nechte nidasa. And we'd say that and we'd have people breathe in through their nose. Then we say, how do you say hold your breath? And it's iteseko kuchte kashat. And then we'll have them hold their breath. And there's different breathing exercises you can do where you're holding for a certain number of seconds. And then you have them breathe out, kuchte nidasa, which is breathe in is breathe into the home, breathe out is breathe it back. And then kayek, which is be still or calm. And while we're doing this, we'll say, okay, before you breathe in, think about the strength of your ancestors. Think about the courage of your future generations and what you want them to be. Think about everything you've overcome. And think about the things that lead you here that make it easier for someone else. And then as you breathe out, think about fear. And think about anger. And think about resentment and jealousy. And think about something that hurt you. And let it go. Sometimes with intergenerational trauma, we learn to carry trauma around instead of finding ways to release it. The way I was taught is you ask your ancestors for help, and you ask them to take it away. Because it's something, you don't want to carry this thing around. It's too heavy. This is one of my favorite speakers that I had a chance to work with. His name was Kahwan Ish. I was recording him. We had all this equipment set up. I had packed it all up. And he says, let me tell you something my mom used to say to me all the time. He said this beautiful thing. And so I grabbed my phone, and I hit the little record thing, and I said, could you say it one more time? And what he said was, you do not speak or act with ill will with the people of the world who are like yourself. Only love and kindness, put that in your heart. The world is spinning around. It's going to roll up to the place where your life will be going out of control. Maybe illness too will come your way. That is why only love and kindness, put that in your heart. However your life gets out of control, these people you have been kind with, maybe they will help you. So thinking of this, like there's a reputation we have among some people who are newcomers to our lands that we like to fight all the time, that we're just real mean people. I was teaching one time and this lady came up whose father worked at this boarding school, and she was quite elderly. She was non-native, and she came up to me afterwards. She might have had, I heard later she had a bit of dementia, so her filter was maybe a little bit clear. And she said, that was wonderful. I didn't know people who aren't Tlingit were allowed to learn Tlingit. And I said, well, y'all living on our land, so you should learn our language. You should use it. Everybody should use it on these lands. It should be just the language of the place. And then she said, and it was funny, and it was fun. And I didn't realize that Tlingit people laughed. And I said, oh, well, when you were growing up, like, you guys were stealing everything from us, taking our lands, making us go to these schools, not letting us be ourselves. And that wasn't very fun. But we were still over here telling jokes, so I don't know. We've always been laughing. But I do quite a bit of work thinking about the boarding school era. I'm not proud to say that I think it started in Sitka, Alaska, with this demon of a man named Sheldon Jackson, who had this idea that you could take native people and make them useful for white people by putting them through these schools where you prohibit their language, where you turn them into industrial workers who could serve the greater good of whiteness or whatever it was. I don't know what he was thinking. But I know what the result is. And now we're here putting the pieces together, and I hear there's an apology coming from the president. There was an apology from the Pope. And I think that's pretty good. That's pretty good. But if you go burn someone's house down, sorry isn't enough. You got to help build that house. So a lot of this work that we do in these very small pockets. We're scratching for money. We're trying to figure out how to shift all this different stuff. And I get frustrated sometimes. And I've watched our elders who stood up and say, "Why are we doing this by ourselves? We didn't do this. We didn't want this to happen." But so I'm so thankful for gatherings like this. I'm thankful to the indigenous peoples of this place, to the Pueblo of Sandia, to the Indigenous Language Institute for bringing us together. Because I think through unity through a common cause, which is more than survival, is what we need. So I think of people who went to boarding school. This is Jaqait Kla. She was wonderful to speak with. She talked about when she went to school and they would hit her hand with these rulers whenever they spoke their language, and she went to school in the place where I was born. This is Shakshani Marge Dudson. On her very first day of school, because she spoke her language, a teacher picked her up by the hair, shook her violently, and dropped her on the floor and threatened to hit her if she did it again. She cried going home. She was so scared. And then she watched her parents get into this huge physical altercation because her father was going to go kill that teacher. Because I couldn't imagine, when she told me this story, my oldest was about 4 or 5 years old. So we did homeschool. Because I said, well, if she goes to school, she's going to stop talking. Because she spoke so much of our language. It was so fun to watch. I'd been teaching adults. I said, 60 years is a long time. We don't know how children learn our language anymore. And one day I was sitting with my daughter. I was like, I wonder if this is working. So I said, and she sat down and took her socks off. I was like, yeah, it's working. I don't know how. So time immemorial is a fun concept for me. I don't know if this is a real word. I don't speak Latin. But they were like, it's the sesquicentennial, or it was something. It was like 150 years of Alaska. I was like, well, that's cool. We've been here 15,000 years, bro. So good job getting to 0.01%. But yeah. So, but I think about that. colonization is this 400 or 500 year thing. In Alaska is a little bit later. But it's just a tiny new thing. And like some of the stuff, like in the town where I was born, we call it Shqaqui. They just celebrate the gold rush. Like, this is the beginning of this town. I was like, yeah, we were here. And there's a lot of people in the town where I grew up that have this donut hole theory, where they'd say, oh, well, the Tlingit lived all around here, but not here. I was like, okay, I don't know how that works, but like, we literally have all these names here. We know about these houses we had here, but go ahead. But I think erasure teaches us to not think about that. It teaches us to not think about just how long that is. So like the English language is not that old. But some of our languages, like we have the same names, the same songs, the same sentences that have been spoken in one place for almost 20,000 years. So then I think, well, what would 20,000 years from now look like? And how do we make sure that our language remains? So that's a lot of what drives my work. So I think about this, I think about words from some of our elders who would say things like, we're going to put our kindness to your open wound. Because I think a lot of our people, there's this phrase we have in Tlingit, which is kataduk. It means it's solid. Like this stage is solid, and this is solid, and a rock is solid. But it also means, I was cutting frozen fish a couple weeks ago, and I was cutting the backbone out, and I didn't pay close attention, and I should have waited till it thawed. I was being impatient, and the knife slipped, and I cut myself. I knew it was a deep cut on the tip of my finger. And it was very hard to be a keyboard warrior when one of your fingers doesn't work. I was like, how do I type around that thing? But it took a couple weeks till it got, like, it's solid now. So this word kataduk also means for a wound to heal completely. So one of the things I want to be honest about is the number of people who have left our language program because somebody hurt them. And in particular, I want us to focus on the health and well-being of our women. Missing and murdered Indigenous women is an absolute movement we need to support, but we have to support it by saying, yes, we stand for women, but we also have to support it by saying, this behavior is not okay. This behavior is not okay, and we need to do better. So in our language movement, we're doing a lot of work on ourselves, individually and collectively, because this requires a lot of different stuff. These are lifelong conversations on how to be humble enough to accept that you might not know the answer. But collectively, and with the wisdom of your people and the strength of your people, I think you can figure it out. Okay, I got 15 minutes. So I like terms. I'm happy to, I'll put my email address at the end of this. I can send you this slideshow. You can use it however you want, whatever you want to do. Indigenous language movement building is one of my favorite terms because it's sort of, for me, the collective thing, the whole sort of thing. And so this is what we're trying to do, is we're building a movement. I believe that Indigenous language reclamation is also a great term to use because we're taking back time and space for our languages. We did an exercise where we sent people into the grocery store. We're like, we gotta get out of the classroom. So we go to the grocery store and we said, okay, we got a beginning class, an intermediate class, an advanced class. I need one person from each class, and then you guys will form this little power trio. We gave them these little pieces of paper that said, I'm not being rude, but we're speaking only in our language right now. I could talk to you in English later. Because I knew, we're pretty big. We're like 35,000 people, but we only have a couple stores. So I love going to Costco because I see all my friends and family. It's like visiting, right? So it was always the relatives of people who are like, oh, this is great. You're in the language. How's it going? And they're trying to show them this piece of paper. Like, I can't talk to you right now except in our language. But I also want to be sensitive. Like, I don't want our people to feel left out because they don't speak our language. But I want them to feel and honor that obligation when our ancestors called to them. But as we're walking around Fred Meyer, that was a problem. But the other thing that was a problem was these three people are in an aisle and they're trying to converse in Tlingit. and somebody says loud enough for them to hear, if they want to live here, they better learn English. It's like, get out of town. So within a language movement, you can have sort of three general types of activity. So is your language safe? If your language is safe, then your goal is indigenous language stabilization. Stay where we are. Is it, and the biggest thing for me is intergenerational transmission. Our grandparents talking to parents in the language, and our parents talking to kids, and our kids talking to grandparents. If that's happening, awesome. And more than just a handshake, right? A handshake language is a good step, and what that means is two people encounter each other. Wasa iati, how are you doing? Yak I'm good. Wa I'm good. Then you switch to English to talk about everything. But have your language be the medium. Who won in basketball? Who hit it big in bingo? Who's sneaking around at night when they shouldn't? Like all the stuff. Like you gotta find ways to say it. There was this guy and he had this story about someone who ran around with someone else, and then the one who got run around on rolled a big boulder on them. And so I was like, I know who could translate this story. So, because we had elders, we had these missionaries who came among us, and they were wonderful. Jillian Story, Constance Nash, they have Tlingit names, Chachuka and Natstla. And at the time when they came around in the 1960s, there had been maybe 2 or 3 white people ever who had learned our language. They just never did it. But these 2 ladies, they spoke the language, these 2 young white missionaries. So they go to this community, they say, who knows the language really well? They say, oh, you should go talk to her. They go knock on her door. She opens the door, and they start speaking Tlingit. And the lady slams the door on our face. Later, when they start talking, she's like, I'm sorry I slammed the door. I thought you guys were ghosts, because white people don't speak our language. But they were groundbreaking. But they also, because probably of their faith and their belief and being descended from Puritan culture, body parts were embarrassing to them. And so they have this dictionary, which is wonderful. But as I read it, I was like, well, one of my teachers, he said, this dictionary has got everything. It's got all the verbs. And I was like, no, it doesn't. He says, well, what's missing? I was like, if this was my language, I can't poop, I can't pee, and I can't make more people. And my aunties and uncles told me how to say those things. So you also have to know which elders you can go to, because some of them, would have a group of elders and be like, how do you say it? Because some elders would say, we don't tell people, go poop. I was like, if you're raising kids, you got them on the toilet, and you got to teach them stuff, right? The language of parenthood is a whole different ballgame. And so no one would give us, there were situations where we had other things too, where we had to talk about hard stuff. How do you talk about child molestation? How do you talk about sexual assault? Because I want to have those conversations so we can prevent those things in our communities through honest and open conversations about how to be healthy human beings. And some of them, they wouldn't say anything. And this one, the one that I talked about earlier, who talked about kindness and stuff, he was also so wonderful, because sometimes he'd wait till everybody left and say, I'll tell you how to say that thing. If your language is endangered, which means you're losing more speakers than you're gaining, then your goal is indigenous language revitalization, getting back to a place of strength. And if your language is asleep, nobody speaks it as a medium of day-to-day communication, then you're in the business of indigenous language revival. These take different techniques, and I think it's good to know what you're doing. Because we run into these things at home too. Someone says, yeah, we got this immersion program. And you go in, and it's all English with a little bit of language. I was like, okay, that is cultural immersion, but if you're talking about language immersion, and so trying to just keep, and I'm not trying to embarrass anyone or have them be ashamed or feel like they're not doing the real work. But when I'm teaching students, I'll say, well, let's say if I said, hey, I'm going to run a marathon this weekend. And then when you see me the next week, you'll be like, wow, how's the marathon? He goes, great. I ran 10 blocks. Right? And so you got to you got to know what the thing is to do the thing, I think. So Dr. William Wilson, who is known as Pila. This is his Hawaiian name. Pila is Hawaiian for Bill. He says a language movement is made up of two things: protecting the speakers you have while making new ones, and ensuring your language is the language of power and use. For the work that I do back home, I always go back to this. Because someone might say, hey, can you translate the Constitution of the United States, or the state of Alaska? I was like, no. Because I don't know if that really, it's a resource question, right? Can you read my novel and make sure that the characters are really, truly Tlingit and translate some of these lines? I'm like, no. But if you can contact a student and pay them money and see if they want to do that for you. And so this comes back because sometimes it's easy to get distracted. It's easy to, doing the language thing is difficult. And so I think it's really easy to keep pushing it out in front of you. I wrote this phrase, I haven't done it yet with my students. But it's written in Tlingit, but it says, I'm a gonna. And so, because the other problem is, you say, I'm a gonna. And so sometimes you'll line these things up. It's like, well, once my work settles down, I'll start learning and using the language. Well, as soon as my kid gets out of diapers, I'll start learning and using the language. Well, as soon as, the hunting season is over, there's always this thing to sort of keep it at arm's length. And this is when it requires honest conversations with yourself about how to be continually transformational. To think about transformation, there's some things, I don't know why that word fluent is there, it wasn't supposed to be there. That I would call kahu wutlitsuni kutlitchun. Kahu wutlitsini kutlitchun. Something that hurts people and that is hard to be seen. So some of the things that I think we should change, this is just my opinion, is the concept of a single supreme leader. So among our people, we had a lot more collective communication and collective decision-making, and somehow that has transformed into people. I've had uncles who said, I'm the chief of chiefs. And I'm like, we never had that. We were a communal people. We didn't have a president, And so this idea that comes from a crown, you're chosen by God to lead the people, I really think we need to just be conscious of that and just say, what if we're just humble people? What if I'm just a person? The concept of male dominance. I gave this guy a little leaf. I was like, okay. But this idea, and these are echoes of colonial mechanisms that God gave man dominion over the world. And I'm not trying to insult anybody's religion, but I think, well, no, because this has led to, in our community, and I know some people would be mad at me for saying it, we have adopted misogyny as our own culture. We silence our women. I've been in situations where we'll be sitting there and someone who's old enough to be my mother, she'll say something. And then everyone will just keep talking. So I'll say the same thing and they'll be like, that's a good idea. And I was like, she just said it and you didn't listen to her. But I also think about the dangers that this presents, where men can groom women, cause harm, manipulate people, and we might look the other way. Or we might say, well, we don't want to ruin this young man's life, so let's just act like it didn't happen. But sometimes we perpetuate harm by not taking the courageous step. The concept of indifference to future generations. So we come from, we're a holistic people. Indigenous people is not a singular group, but for Tlingit, we had an elder who would say, our people could see way out into the future in our language. And when I finally got him to talk about it in our language, I was like, oh, that's what he's saying. He's like, they could see way out in front of themselves because they're always thinking of how they're going to take care of their future generations. The concept of first, last, and best. I think this happens all the time. This is the first language program, and people just love writing newspaper stories about it. We've all seen Last of the Mohicans and The Last of the Dogmen and Kevin Costner, The Last of the Lakota. I'm just kidding. I want to make a home safe, okay? But this idea that, we just had a ceremony and someone stood up and said, I'm the last true Tlingit person. I was like, bro, we're all Tlingit, like all of us. What are we doing? But I think these are other things we do because now we'll adopt the idea of blood quantum and we'll make fun of someone because one of their parents is something else. And I think we do these things and we move away from self-love and group love. And these are things I think we should think about. And here's my other more suggestions, is maybe stop using the F word. And I know we love this word, fluent. That's why the word was in there earlier, because I think this is a gatekeeping word. And I know this because when I started teaching Tlingit and people would ask what I do, I was like, oh, I teach Tlingit. They said, are you fluent? I was like, I don't know, I could speak it. I don't know. But I felt like what they're asking me to do is I would produce my BIA tribal card, and then I'd produce my Tlingit Haida tribal card, and then I'd pull out my fluent card. And I think it would create these gatekeeping mechanisms, and it also makes it seem like it's impossible. Because there's not some switch that gets turned, like, oh, they're fluent today. They weren't yesterday, but now they are. So I really like the word fluency, and so we'll get to that. But I think another word I think we should maybe use a little less is immersion. And I know I was using it just a little while ago. But as I started talking to students, I was like, hey, we're going to have an immersion gathering this weekend. They'd say, I'm not ready for immersion. I was like, you've been studying the language for 3 years, so all you got to do is just go talk it. That's it. But it felt like, well, we did have some elders who were like, it's speaker starve. I was like, it's not that. It's nothing like that. I think wrong is another word we should really think about. You're saying it wrong. You're doing it wrong. And changing. They're changing the language. Every language changes if it's alive. If your language is never changing, it might be in decline. This does not mean you just do it any old way. But you're going to have to come up with new words. Skibbity quashini. You're going to have to say that. Even though my daughter would roll her eyes. She's like, don't do that, Dad. But I think these are loaded words. So I think instead of fluent, you could say fluency. And then you could develop like a 10-point scale so that your assessment process is, you can have an assessment process. Say, oh yeah, I'm 3 out of 10. That was pretty cool. But then you light the way. Say, here's how you get to 4. Here's how you get to 5. And so when I say, these are high fluency birth speakers. These are high fluency second language learners, right? And also it allows people to call themselves a speaker very early in the process, which I think is important. I think you should honor the work that they're doing, celebrate them. I think instead of immersion, you could say we're having conversation. We're going to do conversation in our language this weekend. I think instead of wrong, you could say there are no mistakes in language learning. It's all just language learning. You could have fun things, like there's a, let's see, should I set? Okay. Someone came in and this elder said, Masa'iyati, how are you doing? And she said, Khat with the khush. And she meant to say Khat with the khwait. And I don't think she'd know that she said, I've just been sexed, just to say that. So they're all like, and then they realize what happened. And so sometimes you can have moments that are fun and that can be, like, remember when you said this? Okay. And, be a part of your language's change. The young people are going to want to make it their own. But that's a conversation, just like English. When does it go too far? Okay? And I guess to get us towards the end, I just want to really push for this concept of lateral kindness. To be part of a conscious shift away from this practice of hurting each other. And some of this is within the individual. So instead of saying something bad about someone, what if I just said good things about people? And I know there's a bunch of information we have to share, but sometimes there's this sort of, someone's like, oh man, I just heard the worst thing about this person. You're like, tell me, right? And so this need to adhere to gossiping, which is just something to monitor, but also just being kind with each other, just being kind with yourself. So we were trying to hold someone accountable in our community for some very very harmful things. And someone told me, they said, well, hurt people hurt people. And I said, I understand where that comes from. I understand. I grew up in a family that had a lot of difficulties with alcohol, with violence. I understand. I was harmed as a young person by a stranger. I understand. But if a phrase like hurt people is not a complete thought, right? Because harmful people hurt people. Hurt people can heal. But we do need to help people heal, and we also need to hold them accountable for their actions. So for some of the things that I've seen within our community, we do have processes of creating a sense of wholeness and overcoming difficulty. But part of that means saying the thing publicly. And these are difficult situations. These might even, like there might be an elder standing up who is just trashing somebody publicly. And I've seen it. And if you didn't speak the language, you just be like, I wonder what they're talking about. They are hurting somebody actively in the room. And nobody knows how to stop them. So these are just conversations that we need to continue to engage in, to think about how to be a people that love ourselves enough to love each other, to love future generations. My number one goal at this point in life is that our little grandchildren, generations from now, will look back upon the people who are doing work in the Tlingit language, and they'll say, my ancestors were kind people. My ancestors thought about this place that would be where I live, and they helped to create it in a way that I can thrive and I can know that I am valued. Yiko ay Juan, chakuksa aya yeji yene, konakhoya takhtashi, yitlilko haslitsini itu yeti, yagach yidlaq, wuchin yagach tudlaq to cut yuhan. Thank you for your attention. I believe in what you're doing. I hope that you succeed with the strength of your ancestors and with this thing that allowed them to survive. Everywhere, if you go back in the pre-contact days, hard living. So hot in some places, so cold in other places. The language is what enabled them to survive. So I want to plug a couple of things. I had 2 seasons of a podcast called The Tongue Unbroken. I don't think there's a 3rd season coming. It got dropped by the folks who were supporting it. But it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun to have those conversations through like the podcast medium. So I'll probably try something else. The National Native American Language and Resource Center, who I think is presenting later today. I am on that, the working group that's putting that together. So you can reach out to us if you have ideas on what kinds of things would be supportive for you and would help. And also the National Coalition of Native American Language Schools and Programs. This is my email address. You can find me on Facebook. I used to be on X, but I think it's terrible now. Go with strength. Be brave. Do the difficult thing. Engage in the difficult decisions. And reach out for help when you need it. Yeah, well,